All right, so the question I got asked when I brought back the Q&A video idea, which send me more if you have them, but this was the one that came up, was over and underrated fighters. I'm going to start this off not by listing a fighter, but by talking about what over and underrated to me means. And if this isn't what it means to you, then you're probably not going to agree with my ideas. You're probably not going to agree with it either, because when you claim something's over or underrated, you're going somewhat against the general flow to an extent. And obviously that's going to lead to some disagreements. So don't be prepared to not agree with what I'm going to come out with here. But my idea of over and underrated is if you have done a lot and there's not a lot of talk about you, and if you've done very little but there is a lot of talk about you, you're overrated. Basically, it's the same argument I have when it comes to rankings, that what you could potentially do, I don't think has a big impact on it. It's what you've done. It's the past tense. It's you have beaten this guy, this guy, this guy. You looked impressive in those fights. You lost this guy, but you looked pretty good against him. You beat this guy, but he was really beating your ass until you caught a sub or caught a knockout or whatever. Is how you beat a guy, who you beaten, and how they looked. And that's the thing that I'm going to be talking about here that people may or may not agree with. There's other times where people are just stating things that I don't feel are true. And that's the other thing that's going to come out here. So I tried to mix in the weight classes. I tried to get a couple guys from out of the UFC and in the UFC to talk about over and underrated. More about overrating, because not a lot of people came to mind as an underrated fighter. But I mean, here we go. Here's what I got to say. Overrated heavyweights: Alistair Overeem, Junior Dos Santos. This is where I'm going to get a lot of argument, I'm sure. But here's the deal. People talk about both these guys as if they're top 2 or 3 heavyweights in the world. And they may potentially be. But what have they done to deserve talk of that in a ranking sense? Let's look at Overeem. His biggest wins are basically Mark Hunt and Brett Rogers, two arguably top 10 and not top 10 for very long heavyweights. Strikers who also don't test their potential deficiencies. Overeem, well, he looks good. He looks great. He looks like there's not an obvious weakness to him. I still feel his takedown defense very untested. I feel that his grappling game in a prolonged sense is very untested. Yes, he has a very, very good guillotine, and he doesn't get submitted much, but he hasn't really been tested. That's the thing. He has great knockout power. He has great A1 kickboxing abilities. K1 kickboxing doesn't necessarily translate to MMA, though, and we've seen this in K1 kickboxers who have lost in MMA in striking matches. Semi Schultz is a good example of that. So it's not. That's the other thing I suppose I didn't mention about over and overrated. What you do outside of the sport of MMA doesn't really affect your in MMA abilities. That's something people get caught up on. They talk about ADCC, and when you're breaking down a fight, this is fine. But you talk about ACC, you're talking about K1. People always go back. Overeem's a K1 kickboxer. How does that affect MMA? K1 kickboxing isn't the same, even on a striking level, to MMA. So that's the thing. So that's about all I have to say on Overeem. You can argue with it if you want, but again, try to remember that I'm not trying to take potential into this idea that he should be a top 3 heavyweight. Junior Dos Santos. Longer resume is some good stuff. Roy Nelson, Gabriel Gonzaga, Gilbert Yvel, Fabricio Verdum, of course, Mirko Cro Cop. Let's look at those wins, though. Knocked out Verdum. Granted, that doesn't happen a lot. Has happened, though. Fight never went to the ground. I think any win over Verdum where it doesn't go to the ground, maybe it's a credit to your ability to keep it standing, but I don't think it's a credit to your ability to strike or even knock someone out. I think Dos Santos is overhyped on what I like to call the flashy knockout factor. That people kind of hides other issues that he has in his skill game. We look at the Cro Cop fight. We look at the Nelson fight. We even look at the Gonzaga fight. All of them managed to hit him pretty good. Like his striking defense, to me, has holes in it, is very Swiss cheese-like. He seems to have a reasonably good chin, but he gets hit a lot. The other thing people talk about is how great his takedown defense is. Whose takedowns has he stopped? Gonzaga didn't really go for any. Verdun didn't go for any. Nelson's are not great, and were highly telegraphed. Again, that's the thing. He has great hand speed. He has great knockout power. But I do not believe that, again, he deserves this top 2, top 3. He has the great chance to silence me on this if he goes out there and he, puts the hurting on Cain Velasquez. That would be the defining moment. And Overeem has the same one if he ever got to fight with Fedor. And Fedor didn't look like garbage. It's kind of the problem because we are starting to think Fedor might be getting a bit old and a bit not Fedor, if you know what I mean. That idea is creeping into our heads. He could silence me, but as it is, he hasn't beaten anyone in a fashion that leads me to believe that he really is that guy. I believe he has knockout power. I believe he has good hand speed. I believe his offensive striking is pretty good technically. I believe his takedown defense is existent. I believe his ground game is reasonably good. But I think people overhype all of these elements and completely ignore the lack of striking defense. So moving down to 205, couldn't really think of anyone overrated. To be honest, John Jones, Phil Davis kind of came to mind, but I really looked at it. People aren't really stepping it up on them. They are talking about it in terms of potential, which I like. That's fine. You can talk about a guy in terms of potential, how he could potentially be a champion. But I think when you're rating someone, you're talking about what they have done. And I think that's sometimes what people get caught up on. 185, again, no one really comes to mind. A lot of the hype trains have been derailed in a nutshell. And there's no one that really comes to mind. 170, Dan Hardy still comes to mind because people are still talking about him as if he's a guy who will someday take the title. I suspect it's British fans. If it's not, I apologize. But they're still talking about how good he is. And, the thing is, he has pretty deficient wrestling. His ground game is really not that good. And his striking is not that good. And his knockout power that people love to talk about, who has he knocked out? Rory Markham. That's par for the course, people. That's not impressive. I guess Michael Bisping is still somewhat overrated at 185 because people are still talking to him like he should be a title fighter. But every time he steps up in competition, minus Dennis Kang, he loses. And that's kind of really all there is to that. I think that's all that needs to be said about that. Every time Bisping gets a chance to step up in competition, he loses. Nick Diaz is a guy who, for other reasons, is overrated. People don't talk about him as if he's a top 3 welterweight, but at the same time, they keep saying of how much better he would do in the UFC than when he last washed out. And I think the thing is, he's got the same problem as Nate Diaz, and EDB Dubs went over this a great deal when he was talking about the DHK Nate Diaz fight. This is kind of the same thing, is that Nick Diaz, he has a kryptonite that there's a lot of at 170 in the UFC. There's Jake Shields, Josh Koscheck, John Fitch, GSP. Martin Kampmann even comes to mind as a guy who might be able to do it. And that is take him down and just not get subbed. He doesn't have the wrestling part. There is an element of his game that is highly deficient. And we don't see it in Strikeforce because there's no one really to do it with, particularly with Jake Shields gone. There's really no one that will do it, which is fine. But in order to, do what people say is, and that is say he would, like without a doubt do, which is fight his way to a title and be the big challenge for GSP and everything, I don't think so. Would he get a title shot if he came to the UFC? Probably after 2-3 wins because we're getting a little low. I mean, we are, when Jake Shields loses, kind of giveaway prediction there. When Jake Shields, okay, I'll say if he does lose, I mean, there's really nothing left for GSP to fight for a title. And as such, Diaz could probably come in and get a title shot, but that's about it. 185, again, no one really comes to mind. That's about right. 145, not much came to mind either. Nor at 135. So people are getting better, I think, with this whole overrated syndrome. But I think particularly the Alistair Overeem and JDS hype trains are based too much on potential and not enough on what they have done. On the underrated side of things, not a lot came to mind. Again, I mean, we're seeing the UFC kind of pick up the right guys and kind of hype them and do this thing for us, where we're talking about where they get us talking about guys that we should be talking about, and the ratings coming in and the hype train, being there for almost everyone who's kind of deserving it. But I don't know, the guys I kind of find in no particular order that don't get enough love is Mark Bocek. People were calling him crazy for calling out George Sotiropoulos, and I don't think that's crazy. I think that the man has an amazing grappling ability. He's not a title contender or anything. I mean, I'm not trying to overhype the guy. I'm just saying that I think he doesn't get talked about enough when we're talking about guys you're looking forward to see fight, or guys that could be in good matchups. Another guy is Diego Nunes. Although with Mike Thomas Brown win, I think we may hear a lot more about him. He's a guy though that I think was getting a little underhyped, a little bit. Rafael Cavalcanti, although the ranking sites have him reasonably high. Feijão, the 205 champion of Strikeforce, is another guy that you don't hear a lot about when you're talking about guys you want to see fight, because I think he's a very exciting, very skilled fighter, and guys that have achieved something. I mean, prior to the King Mo fight, he hadn't really done much, but he is coming off the win over King Mo, and people are still not really talking about him, and that's something that I think is something that may change in time, but he did come to mind as a somewhat underrated fighter. Aside from that, I mean, like I said, the internet has gotten to the point where it's pretty hard to be underrated at this point. It's pretty hard to not be the guy that anyone talks about. Yeah, that's all. If you have some overrated or underrated fighters that you want me to discuss, I'll talk back and forth with you on a message or comments about it. You could argue my selections, and maybe you'll change my mind. I don't think you will, because I think I've really set my way on these, but you never know. But anyways, those are my most overrated and a small selection of underrated fighters. So have a good day. I'm going to go watch Russia versus Finland in what should be an awesome hockey game at the World Juniors. And that's it.